naturally I got into a really frustrated state where it was like, why am I here? I don't need to be here. And, all these things of denial and just anger and, I guess primarily at yourself. And then, everyone else around you just feels that sort of wrath because you're like, why did I do this to get myself here?
Hey, welcome back to Normalize the Conversation. Today I'm here with Antonio, mental health campaigner and speaker. Antonio, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you really?
I'm good, just busy as one is when you're a campaigner and speaker. But yeah, other than that, I'm really well. And thank you for having me here.
Of course, being busy is always good, especially when you're fighting for such an important cause. And I'm just so excited to have you here with me. And I really want to know what inspired you to start advocating and fighting for mental health?
I think it's mainly due to the people around me, actually, the people who first got to hear my story and, said to me that there's something really powerful about my story. I remember when I first signed up to be a volunteer, it only came as actually something that I was told to do by my lecturers as, they would say your degree is not enough. You need to get more experience outside of your degree so that you can find a job because, it's competitive. And so I just thought one day, you know what, let me just sign up to a mental health charity as a volunteer. And from doing that, I told my story and, the people who heard my story, they were like, you've got a really powerful story and you should really follow through with this. And then from there, things just started building up. I signed up to another 9 charities, became a media volunteer, and it just kept going.
That is absolutely amazing. And when you open up about your story, to have all that support and people encouraging you is just incredible. And you keep talking about this story. So would you mind sharing your mental health story with us?
Yeah, sure. So I'm diagnosed with schizophrenia. And my mental health journey started when I was about 14, 15, I'd say. So I was in high school going through my exams and I was really stressed out at the time, because I had a lot of expectations, I guess, from family, peers, teachers, having been a very high achieving black boy in that year. And I guess I amplified that pressure because, I'd think black or white, if I don't live up to those expectations, it's all over. Or, I have to live. So there was no middle bit. There was no gray area. And from there, I started to get really stressed. I was suffering from pseudo seizures because of this stress. I was becoming really paranoid. I was hearing voices, which at the time I was very ignorant to and didn't understand that they were voices. Till we got to one point where after my exams, thankfully getting all my GCSEs, I still felt like there was this boulder on my back. I was carrying this weight that day by day was bringing me lower and lower. Like it wasn't like I was this macho man that everyone thinks every man should be. I was actually breaking down slowly and slowly. And then at one point, I think I just owned, like it was like I got too close to the ground and I said to myself, I can't take no more. And I felt like the only way I could get rid of this boulder was to attempt to take my life. And that day where I attempted to take my life is, I guess, where everything changed. I was put in section in hospital for 2 years. And yeah, I mean, a lot of stuff happened in those 2 years, both good and bad. I learned a lot and I also lost a lot. But overall, coming out, that's where, I said to myself, look, not everyone, and from what I've seen myself, not everyone makes it out the way I've made it out, coming out stronger or, passionate about things needing to change. Sometimes you come out of that place physically, but you don't come out of it mentally. And yeah, I mean, from then on, knowing that I had overcome such a struggle and, that I was going back to education and following through with things that I once had a passion for, I said to myself, don't be selfish with your recovery. And by that, I mean, those who precede us need the opportunity to hear you so they know that they can also find hope or motivation in you. And yeah, I mean, from there, I just, decided that I would tell my story with no shame and no blame because if it helps someone, what does it matter if someone else is judging me?
That is so beautiful, Antonio. It is so hard when you feel so low and so alone. And in those moments, to realize that I don't want to be selfish with my recovery. I want to open up about it and share it and help someone else who is struggling. That is one of the strongest things anyone can do. I hope you realize how much strength comes within that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Of course. So now you're talking about living with schizophrenia, which is something that we don't talk about enough, especially in the mental health community. We tend to focus on depression and anxiety. So when it comes to schizophrenia, there's a lot of misinformation and a lot of lack of information and a lack of resources. So you mentioned a few symptoms that you were experiencing, such as seizures and hearing voices. What are some other common symptoms that you experience, and how did you recognize them? Because like you said, when you were hearing voices, it took a while for you to realize that you were hearing voices.
Right. Yes. I mean, I think, again, the fortunate thing about me is being quite insightful. And quite that person that wants to learn more and, just keen to learn. When I would be asked, do you believe you have a mental illness? I'd be like, of course not. I'm like, what even is a mental illness? I'm just a normal young person, this is my personality. But then like you start to put reason and logic together, when I'm thinking people are watching me and talking about me, well, I'm asking, are they even looking at me? Do they even know me? What could they be talking about me? What could they be saying? And these are the ways I would challenge the voices that I was hearing. But sometimes challenging those voices, it came with a consequence, because those voices would then have a go at you, and they'd pick on your insecurities because, being a young Black boy, there were a lot of things that I was quite insecure about, that I felt like, if people ever knew, I'd be seen as a weak person and vulnerable, and people would take advantage of. And those exact words were what the voices would play on. You're going to be seen as a weak, vulnerable person that people take advantage of. But then again, when you're struggling with you're battling your mind every day, don't forget that you also have a heart, because I think my heart is what really powered me through a lot of those moments. When you're hearing, your voice telling you you need to sort that person out, your heart tells you that's not right. So you have to make the two work. And when I'd be isolating myself, so some of the other symptoms as well, I'd be low in mood, I'd be isolating myself, not communicating with anyone. It's very easy for your thoughts to bounce off those four walls that you're around. But again, your heart will really power that, because, you start, what I always noticed was, when I'm struggling, I'm more so struggling about how other people will feel about my struggle. And that's where I think my heart came into play. And I thought, you know what, if I can worry about what other people will feel like about my struggle, that clearly means they care about me, and there are people that love me and want to see me be better. And this is where I would say logic and reason really had to come into it. And also just the plain fact of wanting to learn about my diagnosis and mental health in general. And that's, I guess, where I got my passion to study psychology and neuroscience. All those together, I think sometimes it's about flipping the switch and just changing your perspective on things. A lot of your struggles are based on your perspective of it.
Exactly, changing your perspective. And like you said, all these thoughts and voices telling you that you're going to be seen as weak and vulnerable, a lot of that comes from the stigma on mental health, because people who are struggling are perceived to be weak, vulnerable as weakness, and a lot of times they call us dangerous to ourselves, dangerous to others. And it's just heartbreaking. And that stigma really makes us not want to open up and not want to reach out. And what you said about your heart, and your heart keeping you going, and your heart helping you realize that people do care about you, is one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard, because it's so easy to feel lonely. It's so easy to feel like no one understands and no one cares. And to keep that in your heart the whole time is just absolutely incredible. So you mentioned previously that you started experiencing these symptoms around the age of 14 in high school. How long did it take for you from experiencing those symptoms to getting an actual diagnosis of schizophrenia?
I think it took actually being in hospital, because at 14, 15, it wasn't clear what was going on. So my mental health service, they would do lots of assessments, surveys, questionnaires, rifling through ADHD, bipolar, and all these diagnoses. I think only until, I actually recognized that I was hearing voices, because the one thing that's really hard is that, as everyone knows, to diagnose a mental illness, you can't, just do an X-ray or MRI or anything like that. Your output has to match your input. So however much you're sharing is however much, your psychiatrist can look at. So when they ask me about voices, I'd be like, no, I don't hear no voices. I just have these thoughts. So, they're not going to think down that path of schizophrenia. But again, that whole output matching your input, I think that's what sometimes made it longer to diagnose in my case. And also just not being in tune with my care as well. I'd always leave everything down to my psychiatrist or whoever was looking after my mental health, because it was just something I was ignorant to, something that I didn't want the label of, something that I was ashamed of. So yeah, and I actually, the other day, I looked back at all my mental health records, and that's when I found out the most information about my care. It wasn't just a straightforward diagnosis. I had stuff like transient psychosis, polymorphic, all these, clauses that I wasn't ever aware of. But once I became more in tune and wanting to accept and, understand on myself, that's when I started to find out about all the diagnoses I went through, coming down to officially undifferentiated schizophrenia and emotional unstable personality disorder.
Wow. So it sounds like your experience with getting the right diagnosis, and I'm assuming because you did say ADHD and bipolar disorder, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that you must have been put on different types of medications throughout the time as well.
Yeah,
that is so hard. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. You can.
No worries. Yeah, no, that's correct. Yeah, the medication is probably one of the toughest parts of it all. I remember in the mental health hospital, I take morning pills, afternoon pills, and evening pills. And yeah, you're right. I mean, I did change between so many medications, sometimes because of side effects, but also, because sometimes it was the wrong one, or, and that's the thing about mental health, I think, because of the lack of knowledge within it, or maybe it's the lack of knowledge, or maybe the lack of how much we share, that it becomes a thing that's more experimental until you find the right solution.
Exactly. It is very experimental. And like you said before, there is no scan that's going to tell you what's wrong. When you fall and you hurt your wrist, you can go get an X-ray, an MRI, and they can see what's wrong and they know how to fix it. It's very clear and straightforward. But when it comes to your mental health, there's not a scan that is telling them what's going on. So without looking at the brain, it's a guessing game. And schizophrenia is one of the most common mental illnesses to be misdiagnosed. And to go from different types of medications and different types of disorders, from ADHD to bipolar disorder, that is really difficult, because the wrong medications, like you said, side effects can cause adverse side effects that are very dangerous and that are not fair to us, because with the right diagnosis, your quality of life improves, and it took you so long to get the right treatment and right help that you needed.
Right. Yeah. And that's, I think, one thing that people have always got to understand is, sometimes I'd have friends that would just be like, if you want to get better, you will get better. And, it's, to some degree, you are, they are correct. It's like you do have to have that mentality that, you're going to find your way through it all. But it's not as easy and straightforward as you mentioned, with a physical illness or such. But I mean, the one thing that I always say to people is that patience that you're having will only build you to be something greater in the future.
Exactly. And like you said, it's not black and white. It's not that simple and straightforward that if you want to feel better, you will get better. Because no matter how much effort you put into therapy, into taking your medication, into trying these coping mechanisms, when it's the wrong medication, the wrong diagnosis, the wrong treatment plan, no matter how much of yourself you put into it, it's still working against you. The system, the lack of understanding and awareness and ability to advocate for yourself is a huge part, which I'm going to touch on in a minute. But when the whole system is working against you, no matter how badly you want to move forward, it's really, really difficult. It's not just, I want to get better and I'm going to feel better. But one really, really interesting point that you brought up was about how you share and express yourself to the psychologist, to the psychiatrist, to the people who are trying to help you. And I think one of the most common issues is we don't know how to advocate for ourselves, because when we're younger and we start to tell people how we're feeling, a lot of times they invalidate us or they gaslight us. I mean, how often did you hear build a bridge and get over it? Or big girls don't cry, or boys don't cry. You're acting like a girl. There's all these different things and phrases that are so invalidating. So then why would you open up? And how do you know what to share and what people are telling you is all in your head?
Right. Yeah. And, I think that again comes into, flipping the switch and, your perspective and your interpretation of things, because you're right there, there were a lot of moments where that would happen, or, maybe I'd take things away, which I didn't have to, and I think at the end of the day, some things I've learned, a prime example, when we're talking about being judged isn't wrong, right? If you think of it like this only. So judging a book by its cover was a survival skill that we learned from a long time ago, because, some communication wasn't as developed. So we had to judge a book by its cover to learn if there was a threat or a risk coming to us. It's almost as if you go to the library and you look at a book and you look at the cover and you say, oh, I don't think I'm going to like this. Where then the problem becomes is when you stop yourself from opening that first page to really find out if you like it or not, neglecting that whole opportunity from the cover that you've judged. Because as I said, we're going to judge, that's something that's inevitable. And I think we shouldn't run from that or try shy away from that. People are going to judge. It's more about, how do we change someone's judgment? That's what I think is the main thing. When we're talking about negative feelings and emotions, the aim isn't to get rid of negative feelings or emotions. Those have to be there. Sometimes they become useful, to recognize when something's not right or something's going wrong. But what we have to do is manage those negative feelings and emotions, how we react to them. The same way, how do we manage our judgment? How do we react to people's judgments? How do we get people to look at this cover? Okay, here's a young black boy. I don't want to give him an opportunity because he's a young black boy. But as soon as you hear me out, you're like, oh my God, I didn't know, and this and that and so on. Do you know what I mean? It's not, it's not always let's get rid of a system because the system doesn't work. Sometimes it's let's tweak a few things in the system, or let's change how, the procedure works or the protocol goes on. I think that is the biggest thing for people. And I think that's where, again, as I was mentioning, it's how you interpret some things, it's when things happen, they shouldn't always be taken on board as such a negative way. When my friends left me behind in the hostel, not all of them left me behind purposely. A lot of them left me behind to show me, look, where you're struggling, if you don't, work on getting better, not just get better, but work on getting better, don't forget that we also have our own lives to continue with, and our lives can't be paused just for your life to carry on. So these are the things where you have to switch how you interpret them and how you look at them, and use them for motivation, use them to better yourself, and use them to inspire.
Exactly. Perspective is key, and learning how to change your perspective. Like you said, the system might not need to be demolished and rebuilt, but tweaks. And understanding that sometimes people step away, not because they don't love us or don't care about us, but because they have lives too, and they have things going on, and they can't be everything for you. And that's a really hard lesson to learn, but a really important perspective shift. And shifting our mindsets can be huge and crucial to coping with our mental illness. and being able to overcome the struggle that is impairing our lives. So, can you tell me a little bit more about your current mental health treatment? Now that you have the proper diagnosis and the proper support, what does treatment look like for you?
At the moment, so I think, well, at that time when I actually received my actual diagnosis, so it's first, it's better to understand that this is actually what's going on with you. So you kind of start to move away from the frustration of, you don't know what's going on, I don't know what's going on, nothing will ever get better. Now you actually understand that this is what it is. It's almost like, especially with having started at 15 to now 23, I've learned so much. So it's like I now know what's good for me. I know what doesn't work for me. So I won't be put into like group therapies, because I know everyone will know I don't have a great response to group therapies. One-to-one therapies, cognitive behavioral therapy, having a key worker, someone that I can go to directly rather than having to find different people and chase up different people. All these things, and just the resources as well. I think a lot of my ability to change my mindset comes from the resources that I've built and gained, and the support bubble that I've had around me. So in a nutshell, for me, it's more just, I can recognize when a trigger is coming. I can recognize, how bad I'm feeling. So, sometimes you'll get asked on a scale of 1 to 10, how bad are you feeling? And you'll just give a random number closest to 5 because it feels like the most even to you, or, closest to whatever that you might feel, but it might not be. As I could pretty much pinpoint, okay, I'm feeling a 7. Why am I feeling a 7? Why am I 3 away from a 10? Or, why am I feeling like 2? Why am I 1 away from 1? It's really being in tune, as I said, with your mental illness and, understanding everything around your diagnosis. I go through my care plan sometimes. I go through, like I said, the resources that I've gained, looking at catastrophic thinking, and all these things, just, all of it, I think, for me, worked because of the knowledge I gained about it. And I think, again, we can't take away from knowledge is power, because when you know better, that's when you can do better. When you don't, you become like confused and not knowing where to go. And yeah, I think, and it just like, to me, any decision I make, right or wrong, I always think, okay, so what did I miss out in taking this decision? If I take a right turn, all I've missed out is on the left turn. I can still come back around, or if I can just carry on and see where that road takes me, as long as I know whatever, speed bump hits me or red light or whatever, I can still carry on after. That's the main thing.
That is the most amazing metaphor I have heard for mental health recovery, because it's so true. Sometimes you make a left turn and you should have made a right, but that doesn't mean you can't get back there. It might take a little longer. You might feel lost and confused for a bit, but you'll get there, and you can get there. And that is so important. And it's recognizing that it's not impossible. And sometimes when we try something and it doesn't work, and we expect it's going to work, and we think we're going in the right direction and we're not, we start to feel so defeated and so hopeless and like we're never going to get better. But you can get better. You will get better, because everyone's different, and it takes us our own journeys. And just because one treatment option worked for you doesn't mean it's going to work for me. And just because it worked for me doesn't mean it's going to work for you. And that's so important as part of your recovery, is to know that you can't follow someone else. If you're following someone else down the road, you're only going on their journey, not on your own. So now you talked about being in the psychiatric system, in the psych ward, for 2 years. What was it like, and what did you wish you would have known before going in?
Oh, you know what? Okay, so there were stages to it. When you first get into the psych ward, you think, okay, you know what? Time will pass. Let me just stay in my room. And, at one point, someone will come in and be like, okay, you're ready to go. But then you realize the psych ward doesn't work like a jail or prison. You don't have an official release date. That release date only comes with progress and someone's opinion that you are ready to come out into reality. So, after I realized that staying in my room and, not engaging wasn't going to work, naturally I got into a really frustrated state where it was like, why am I here? I don't need to be here. And, you know, all these things of denial and just anger and, you know, I guess primarily at yourself, and then, you know, everyone else around you just feels that sort of wrath, because you're like, why did I do this to get myself here? And then you realize that, you know, that as well wasn't going to help you any further, because it's not showing or any indications or signs of recovery or improving. Till then, eventually, you know what, you've been there so long that you know the ins and outs, you know how things work, you know the timings, you know everything about the routine, and then you just learn to engage. You learn that, you know, I actually do want to get better, and I'm actually only gonna get out of it when I do decide to get better. And that's why I'm here longer, because I haven't decided, I haven't come to terms that I want to get better. I've just stuck in this denial, ignorance mindset, or, you know, hopeless mindset that, you know, it is what it is, but it's not always what it is. Sometimes you can make it what it is. And that's where I just really came around to, you know, I cooperate with medication, I cooperate with therapies, I cooperate with, you know, not just for cooperating, but because if this is what's going to get me better, then I will get a release date. And eventually I did. And, you know, I think something that I wish I'd known, I guess, was that last mindset that I developed, you know, knowing that, you know what, this is the, like, you're actually only here, you know, whatever way I might get mistreated in some occasions, or however way I might take in someone's, you know, words of, you will never leave until I decide you're leaving. That's not what I should be focusing on. You know, it's very easy to focus on something negative and forget what the positive that's going around, or, you know, very easy to focus on the lack of something rather than the abundance of something. So I wish I had that. I wish I knew about that last mindset I developed from the beginning, because maybe that would have made my time shorter. But then I also think to myself sometimes, I don't want to put myself in that mindset of, I wish this had happened this way, I wish this had happened that way, because I think everything happened specifically for a reason, for me to be where I am today with the resilience and the work that I am doing. And, you know, those 2 years, maybe those 2 years is what I needed to learn as much as I know now.
Exactly. And wow, just wow. I love your perspective on everything, because a lot of times when you're talking about mental health and your recovery and being in the psych ward, we see all the bad things. We point out everything that went wrong, and we don't point out the mindset shift. And when you decide to start engaging, maybe the group therapy sessions inside the psych ward didn't work for you, but you wouldn't know that if you didn't try. You wouldn't know what coping skills, what resources, what treatment options work for you unless you try, unless you put in the effort. So just because it didn't work doesn't have to be a negative thing. It can be positive because you learned something and got one step further along your recovery. Thank you so much for that beautiful share.
No worries. And yeah, I think, you know, as I was mentioning before, I think that time, I use it effectively now, in the sense that, you know, I recognize that I will have bad days. You know, not every day is perfect, and you've got to come to terms with that. Not every day is perfect. Not every day, you know, we're going to be smiling, but that's okay. And where it's better is knowing that that's okay means that you will come back from it, because, you know, I might have a bad morning, but there's 24 hours in a day, so level it out. The rest of the day is still mine for the making. And, you know, that experience that I had is now my threshold, because with any bad hour that I have, a bad day, I know I'm not as bad enough that I need to go back there, which means I can get better.
Exactly. And now I want to talk a little bit more about schizophrenia, because like we said in the beginning, there's a lot of lack of information out there. And when we see the media portraying someone with schizophrenia, they tend to be this violent character. They're usually the villain. So there's a lot of misconceptions out there. What are some of the biggest misconceptions that you've seen, and how have they impacted you?
I think the biggest one is what you said, you know, just that if you're schizophrenic, you're a threat, you're violent, you're dangerous, quite erratic, and all these things that come from the media and how the media portrayed it. But as I said, as someone with schizophrenia, a moment ago I was talking to you about how my heart got me through most of the moment. So it's it's hard enough knowing that I'm challenging myself, but then having to challenge other people's perspective of me as well just creates a big workload, and sometimes that's what adds on to wanting to give up, because it's like I'm already doing so much fighting my own challenges, and now you're adding on to it because you lack knowledge of what it actually means. There's so minimal research that people with schizophrenia are actually violent and dangerous, and a threat. It's a lot of the times we are struggling trying to challenge those voices telling us to do something because we know we don't want to hurt no one else, that we end up hurting ourselves. So, someone else's, I guess it's a difficult way to put it, but where our voices have wanted us to hurt someone else, we've ended up taking that on ourselves because we don't want to hurt no one else. So you know what, we'll hurt ourselves instead, because why should someone else suffer with what I'm suffering, if that makes sense? So I think that's the biggest misconception that really got to me. And I think that's also what's really humbled me down a lot. And, I've always understood that there's always two sides to a story, not just my side. But also, if you want to step into someone's shoes, don't forget to come out of your own shoes first.
Yes, that is very, very true. And this stigma, like you said, has created this lack of awareness, therefore a lack of education. So when we see the media portray someone a certain way, then we just group everyone together and we assume that everyone living with schizophrenia, everyone living with a mental illness in general is dangerous, is a threat, and we need to avoid them. And if we find someone or meet someone who is living with a mental illness, we need to stay away from them because it could be dangerous to us. It could bring us down. And that's not true. But the stigma, the lack of education, the lack of awareness is leading to this, which is making it so much lonelier. It's making it so much more difficult to get that support that you need. And emotional support is a huge part of recovery.
Yeah, definitely emotional support, and as well emotional intelligence. I've definitely learned that, in situations where you want to react emotionally, take a step back, because acting on emotions has never been the best solution. Sometimes, simple things like, if a friend doesn't message you back, you start to get emotional, you might react emotionally, but don't forget that they also have a life to live. So, where they haven't messaged you back, maybe they've, because, I'm us two sitting here right now, I've probably received like 6 missed calls, and, my friends are probably going to think I'm ignoring them, but you forget that, we have a life to live and activities that are going on in our lives. But if you constantly act emotionally, you'll never come to understand that. So it's about having that emotional intelligence as well.
Exactly. That is so true. And recognizing that just because you waved at somebody and they didn't wave back at you, they might not have seen you. Just because someone didn't answer your text right away doesn't mean they're ignoring you. They might have something else going on. And recognizing when somebody is genuinely not supporting you, who is invalidating you, who is gaslighting you, who is labeling you, those are people who don't want to support you. But just because it takes someone a little bit of time to get back to you, that doesn't mean they're not there for you and they're not supporting you. And recognizing the different types of support and what they mean is huge when it comes to recovery. Antonio, you have been absolutely incredible. Thank you so much for joining me today and for sharing your story.
No worries, and thank you for having me. It's a really nice conversation.